In this video, I'm going to talk about taking a risk-based approach to audit projects. Now, I know, I hear this from a lot of people, where they're saying, hey, I think I'm doing a risk-based approach, but I'm not really sure how to do it at a project level. And here's the reason. A lot of people are doing a risk assessment as part of their audit plan. So they create an audit universe, they do some kind of risk ranking of it. And from that, they determine their audit projects that they're going to do during the year. And most people think that is risk-based audit. And then they go ahead and do traditional audit work at the project level. Now, it's not really. I understand why people feel that way because there's a lot of people, including the IIA, that kind of talk about it in that way. But risk-based internal audit is really more objective-centric, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it here in this video. Now, to give you some context, again, some of you may be thinking, I already understand this. Great. Okay, you don't need to listen to the video. But most people, when they're honest with themselves, are like, I don't quite know how to do that. I don't quite have the tools or know how to, especially if you may be doing it for the audit plan, how do I translate that into an audit project? And so that's what we're going to talk about, because actually this last week I had a coaching call with the Chief Audit Executive. And again, this is a person who has been in the industry for a long time, but had some questions specifically around this idea of risk-based audit projects as they were kind of going through some changes in their organization. And so let me give you a little bit of context just to begin with, because I think there's some important learnings from this as well. And, what you're going to find is, again, what I'm talking about today is relevant for most of you, but it may not be applicable in every situation. And so I'm going to talk about the difference there too on compliance versus risk-based, and why sometimes actually a compliance-based approach may be better than risk-based. Okay. And so, the context, this person is a chief audit executive at a manufacturing company. We'll call it that. I'm going to keep everything confidential. And so they have locations that manufacture their products. And they've got lots of different brands, lots of different locations. They're based here in the U.S., so their operations are here in the U.S. Okay. And, the CAE has been there for probably 2 years now, I'm saying, in this role. But they got a new chief financial officer less than a year ago. And so, anytime that there are new executives, new board members in an organization, there's an opportunity and also usually a requirement to change some of what we're doing, because executives may have different expectations, board members may have different expectations. And so the chief audit executive has to take these things under consideration. And so that's what happened. This new CFO had come in and said, you guys really aren't going out and doing location audits at the manufacturing facilities. I think that would be important for you to show up, have your face there, know that people are actually auditing. So I would like you to come up with some location-specific audits and actually go out and audit the locations every so often. So the chief audit executive had to kind of change, what they were doing, and needed to come up with some location related audit program, if you want to call it, but even not quite like that. Okay. And so we've had several discussions about this. And, at first, the CAE was thinking that they would take more of a compliance approach. And so, for a lot of organizations where maybe the context of your organization is, hey, we expect everybody, right, in our company to follow the same policies, the same guidelines, have the same processes in place, use the same systems. And so if that's the case, and you're mainly looking to make sure that all of the individual locations are following kind of the corporate policies, then maybe a compliance type audit is better from a location perspective. Because what you're doing is you're setting criteria that is the same across the organization. You're expecting every location to follow the same policies, the same rules, the same processes. And so what you're looking for is any deviation from that, right? Because management's expectation is, hey, everybody's going to follow these rules. And so that can be a very valuable approach to take if you are in that situation. Or let's say if you're in a highly regulated industry like banking, sometimes the branch audit, location audit, are much more compliance in nature. Why? Again, because often the banks are requiring each of the branches to follow the same processes, have the same controls. Sometimes those are expectations from the regulator. And so in those instances, coming up with kind of a standard way of auditing each location may make sense for your organization. But for a lot of the audit projects, that doesn't necessarily make sense because things are different. And in fact, as I talked with the Chief Audit Executive more, they're like I said, there's different brands. They're producing different products under different brands at different locations. And so because of that, their company doesn't require all of the locations to follow the same processes. And so because of that, it didn't necessarily make sense. They went out and the first one or two, they kind of tried to take a compliance approach and then came back and talked to me again and said, the local president, the local general manager, we got some feedback that kind of made it seem like they didn't think what we had done was of very much value. And so as we talked about it, we found out why and decided that more of a risk-based approach on those particular audit projects and locations would make a lot more sense, because that means it's going to be much more relevant to the local management, to the president, to the general manager of the area. But it's also going to mean that the audit work done at each location is going to be slightly different. And again, I know this is one of the reasons why a lot of people in internal audit have not truly embraced a risk-based approach, because they want to be able to come up with one audit program and do it everywhere they go. They don't want their people to have to go through the whole process of thinking and coming up with what the objectives for the location are, what the risks are, and really tailoring the audits in that way. I think it's a better approach, like I said, especially when you're not requiring everybody to be the same. It allows, for much more perceived value on what we do when we're actually tailoring each audit project to that particular situation. And so that's kind of a background on, why we're talking about this and why sometimes compliance may be better than risk-based. But for the rest of this, let's talk about taking a risk-based approach. And, again, some people, it takes more time in the planning phase to do risk-based approach than it does if you're just using a standard work program. When I was at Arthur Andersen, we developed something called the business audit. It was a completely new way of auditing our clients. We spent years and millions of dollars coming up with this. And one of the things that we learned was, we needed to spend a significant amount of time in the planning phase. And that was because we were understanding the objectives and the risks associated with that particular part of the business. It takes time to do that. And I know a lot of times people, especially when we first implemented it at Andersen, a lot of the partners were really frustrated because they felt like we weren't doing audit work for most of the audit. But that's the reality in true risk-based auditing. When you're taking a more objective-centric and risk-based approach, You're going to spend more time in that planning and we used to call it understanding the business phase, because each part of your business is going to be slightly different. And until you understand the business, until you understand the objectives and the risks associated with that particular location or business unit or whatever you call them in your organization, we can't really design audit testing steps until we do that. And so again, it requires auditors to actually think and to understand risk management. And again, I've shared before that a lot of chief audit executives want to do more risk-based auditing, but they can't find people who can think in that way. And so they can't do it as much as they would like to. So I'm talking more about risk-based audit. I've been talking about it for 20 or 30 years. I thought I was done talking about it, but hey, I'm talking about it more. Here we go. So what are some things to consider? So when we're taking a risk-based approach, what we're looking at is the objectives, right, of that particular area, the strategies that they're taking, and the associated risks in achieving those objectives. And what processes, what controls, what policies, what management steps, actions, and controls have they put in place to make sure that they're on track to meeting those particular objectives. That's what we're interested in, right? Because we need to understand that to then be able to know what to audit. For example, maybe there is a key management report that management is using to monitor the process. Okay, we may want to test that particular report to make sure that it's actually telling management what they think it's telling them, right? As an example. Right. But you don't know until you get there and you do it. And so, what this is going to look like is it's going to be a little bit different each time. You may have an idea of some particular areas, some particular audit testing steps that you may want to do. But until you go through this understanding the business, looking at the objectives and strategies and where the risks actually are, and that part of the business, you're not going to know for sure what audit tool, what audit test you need to do to be able to test for that. So I'm throwing out some words like the objectives, right? And a lot of times people say, well, but I don't know what the objectives are. How do I find out what the objectives are so that I know what the strategies are, so I know what the risks are? Well, the simple answer is you got to ask. You got to have the discussion. Okay. And this is part of that 60% of the time where you're going to be talking to a lot of people. Maybe you're going to be observing some of the processes, as part of this. And so, the idea is, again, maybe, from a corporate organizational standpoint, we've decided that certain risks to the organization are inherent in a particular part of the business. And so because of that, we choose to put that location, that part of the business on our audit plan, right? Because we know that that's an area where the risk shows up in our organization. So at that point, right, we put it on the audit plan, but we don't know what we're going to do yet. And so when we start the audit project, we need to go through this understand the business phase, if you will. And I call it that. I call it some different things. In fact, when you want more information on risk-based internal audit, check out, and register for the Certified Risk-Based Internal Auditor course. It's a course of about 30 or 35 hours that I put together many years ago that talks about a lot of the things that I'm sharing here, but in much more detail. Okay. So we go out to the individual project. Now, we need to understand what the objectives are. How do we know what the objectives are? We ask, right? We need to sit down with management. We need to understand what their objectives actually are. Now, what are or where would we find these objectives? Like I said, most often it's from actually having discussions with people. It's sitting down with that general manager and saying, okay, what are your key objectives for this year? What are the things that the organization is really on you about making sure that you complete this year? and understanding from them what it is. Now, most likely, their compensation plan, their bonus or incentive is based on them meeting those particular objectives. And so often, if we have access to it, we can actually see based on their compensation plan, their bonus incentives, what is most important for them to accomplish this year. That's a good place to look. Because if your organization does a good job with their performance management process, it's going to be included in there. Now, I know that information is sometimes sensitive and we may not be able to get access to it. If we can, that's great, right? Because then we can compare what the person is saying to what their compensation is actually saying. Those two should match. If they do, then we have a good idea of what those particular objectives are that they're needing to meet this year. Then we can look at it and say, okay, we've got objectives. Now, what strategy are they taking to achieve those objectives? Because again, this is something that people, often overlook. The risk is not in the objective itself. The risk is in the strategy and how we are choosing to meet that objective. Different strategies, different policies, different processes, different controls, different systems all come with different risks. And so that's why we have to understand that in order for us to be able to understand where we're going to audit, or based on that strategy and the processes and things that are put in place, where we need to focus our attention. And so again, that's, one-on-one coaching, we can talk more directly. In a live video like this, I have to talk a little bit more general. So I'm going to just talk through this generally speaking. Okay. So again, we found out maybe what the objectives are for this particular location. And so maybe it is, we need to make sure that we deliver on time 95% of our orders, making something up. Okay. That's our objective. Okay. General manager, what strategy, what processes do you have in place to make sure that you meet that 95% key performance indicator? And, again, they're going to know, because if that is their objective and they're a good manager, I promise you, they have put processes and controls in place to make sure that they meet that 95% number, because their incentive is based on it, right? And managers know how to take care of that. And so again, you start to have the conversation more about how do you know that you're, on track to be able to get that. And they might share some information with you, and you can ask them different questions like, when it's hard to deliver on time, what are some of the bottlenecks? What are some of the things that usually go wrong? Right? Because some good questions to ask people is, what's complicated, what's new, and what's broken, right? And so again, if people know, hey, we really have a hard time in this part of the business. So in this instance, maybe let's say, we have most difficulty delivering on time and on budget when our sales department or our marketing department doesn't get us their expectations in advance, right? Maybe we need 4 weeks of lead time, but they regularly only give us 2 or 3 weeks notice. And so because of that, it's hard for us to schedule everything in process. Okay. Now, right, we're starting to understand a little bit about some of the processes and things that are going on, why they may not be able to meet that. Okay. And again, you can ask more questions, dig into it, but that may be an area of focus, right? Now, something else to consider as you're going through and you're talking with the manager in this area, you're going to want to find out what we used to call monitoring pervasive and specific controls. And so I'll just give you the thumbnail of what those each mean. And from a risk-based approach, what I'm going to tell you is we're not really going to worry about the specific controls. we're going to focus on the monitoring and the pervasive. And I'll share with you why. Okay. But a specific control is something, it's detail oriented. It's a task. It's something that some individual is doing, right? That typically works on the team, works in that location. Pervasive controls are typically seen as things that are culture in basis, like policies, the culture of management, things like that. And monitoring controls are the controls that management puts in place to make sure the pervasive and the specific controls are working. Because again, if they're a good manager and they've assigned a task to somebody, there's going to be some way that they're able to monitor that person's activity and make sure that person is doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's, again, a lot of times management reports show that. Things like status meetings, stand-up meetings, in a manufacturing environment, a lot of times there's like a daily manufacturing meeting, things like that where the managers can monitor what's going on. And so as we're asking the questions, as we're understanding the business, we're going to want to start kind of cataloging in our head, okay, is this a specific control? Is it a monitoring control? Is it a pervasive control? And we're just listing them out. We're not actually going and trying to audit them yet or designing tests to do that. We're just making a list. Remember, we're still understanding the business. But then what you do is once you've kind of got a good idea of the things that are going on at that particular location, and again, risk-based, they're probably going to be slightly different from location to location. There may be some similarities, but there will probably also be some differences. So now that we've cataloged these, now what we're going to say is, okay, how good are the pervasive controls? And if we feel the pervasive controls are good, if we feel like culture is good, if we feel like they've got good policies, if we feel like they've got good IT systems that are delivering accurate information, then we're going to say, okay, great, right? Pervasive seems to be working good. You can even go do a few little tests on that if you want to make sure. Then our next step is going to say, okay, I'm going to test now the monitoring controls. Because if the specific controls were designed effectively, if the pervasive controls and monitoring controls seem to be designed effectively, and pervasive seems to be working, then if we test monitoring controls, that will help us guarantee that specific is actually working. And we don't need to get into all the detail of the specific steps. We test the monitoring. We test what the management is doing, okay, at that point. And so we design tests around ensuring that the monitoring from management is actually happening in the way that it's supposed to. That's where we focus our attention. If our audit tests are good there, then we're done. We're happy. We move on, at that point, and we never have to get down to the detailed level of the specific controls. Now, if the monitoring is not working, then maybe we do jump down there. And I know this video is going a little bit long, but that's a little bit of a snapshot there. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about kind of materiality levels on individual projects, because this is often a question I get as well. In fact, it was one of the questions that the Chief Audit Executive I was coaching was asking about. So, the idea is, and I'm using the word materiality in general to mean what is, what management has control over to make decisions, and what somebody up the chain would think, oh no, that's a big deal, right? And so typically what happens is maybe for your organization in general, nothing is of consequence, materiality, maybe to your shareholders, to your auditors, to your regulators, unless it exceeds $10 million, let's say, okay? I'm just throwing a number out there. And so for the organization wide, maybe the materiality level is 10 million. So we're looking for deviations. We're looking for risks that exceed $10 million because that's important, right, for the people at that level. But what happens when you get down to a location level? And again, a lot of people scratch their head and say, well, do I still use the 10 million from the corporate level, or do I use something else? And what I have found over the years that I usually suggest to people is look at the levels of authority for that local manager. And so again, let's say it's 10 million for the company, but at this particular location, maybe that location manager has approval authority up to $1 million. So anything less than $1 million, they can approve, they can sign off on, they can have an expenditure for that, right? But if it goes over $1 million, then they have to go ask their boss, right? Maybe their boss has 5 million, right, in levels of authority, and then that boss would have to go to the C-suite for 10 million or more. Okay, again, simple, just trying to make it general for you. So how we would look at that for determining kind of materiality at a project level. And what I mean by that is if we find something, if we find an unmitigated risk for more than that material level, then we know we should probably report it up the chain. If it's less than that, it really doesn't matter. And this is one of those areas where internal auditors get in trouble all the time, because they will find something that's $100,000 and they'll latch onto it and they'll put it in their report, and they go to the local management and they're like, oh, you've got to fix this. It's got $100,000 limit. And the manager looks at them and goes, well, I can approve that already. So why are you bringing it up? It's not a big deal. I don't think it's a big deal. Let it go. Right. And that happens often because, right, the auditor has put the materiality level too low. And so in risk-based projects, like I said, look at, whoever the audit client is, whoever the general manager is, the person who's responsible for that area. What are their levels of authority? So in this instance, let's say they're $1 million. Well, if you find something for $500,000, by all means, you can communicate that to the local manager. Hey, we found this, didn't know if you were aware of it or not, but we're just providing it for your information. We're not going to put it in the report. We're not going to ding you over it because we know that you have $1 million of approval authority. If you decide to accept the risk, that's just fine. But if it's 1.5 million, if it's 5 million, now that becomes a finding, if that's what you call it in your organization. Something that you have to report to that local manager, but also something that they need to address, right? Because it's above their approval limit. And so the person up the chain is going to want to make sure, hey, I only gave you $1 million, so you can't decide on 2.5 million, right? You got to bring that to me. You got to show me that you're actually managing that risk down to less than $1 million. And so that's when things would go into the reports, when we would share that with other members of management, when they would be things that we would follow up on maybe as well. Okay. So, again, that's often a question that a lot of people have. Like I said, I'm kind of running out of time today. There's more information in the Risk-Based Internal Auditor course, the Certified Risk-Based Internal Auditor course. Like I said, 30 hours where I'm only on here for about 30 minutes today. But there's also, plenty of other opportunities for you. If you've got questions about this, message me, let me know. Maybe I can do a future video on it as well. But I wanted to just share with you at least some basics because, like I said, a lot of people approach me asking these same questions. A lot of people who've been in the industry for a long time because publicly they don't want to admit they don't know how to do it. And again, that's why people come to me confidentially, one-on-one, or in some of the groups that I have, like the Audit Leader Forum. Those are places where people can actually bring these things up. And so anyway, just wanted to share that with you because I felt like that was going to be helpful for a lot of you. And so again, when you're looking at audit projects, kind of your first thing to think about, well, should this be compliance in nature or should it be risk-based in nature? If it's compliance in nature, you already know how to do it. If it's risk-based in nature, that's what I was talking about today, some of the different steps that you can go through to make sure that you're more objective-centric and more risk-based in how you are approaching your audit projects. So thanks for listening, and I will see you on the next video.